Okay. So today we're going to go over some themes in Simone Weil's writings on life, spirituality, and death. So these are some photographs of her. The one on the left, that's she actually died fairly young in her 30s, but this is in her 30s. And then the one photo on the right, that's when she was a university student in Paris. So let's go over her biography first. She was born in Paris, France on the 3rd of February, 1909, to a Jewish middle-class family. And she started studying in 1928 at the École Normale Supérieure, uh, a very well-known university in France, where she wrote a dissertation on knowledge in the philosopher René Descartes. And then she taught philosophy at lycées, which are basically secondary schools or high schools from 1931 to 1934. And she was influenced by Marx, Descartes, and Kant. August 1932, she traveled to Germany to better understand Nazism. And then in June 1934, she took a break from teaching and she spent a year working in Paris factories with female laborers. So she's obviously a Marxist and she was very much interested in activism. And um, she had her first encounter with Christianity in 1935 because she was watching a festival honoring the patron saint of fishing villagers. And she realized that Christianity is a religion for slaves. And then she identified as a slave for some reason, even though she came from a middle-class family. So in 1936, the Spanish Civil War started, and she joined an international anarchist brigade. And in 1937, she traveled to Italy, and there was a basilica called Santa Maria degli Angeli, and there was a small 12th century Romanesque chapel where Saint Francis had prayed. And they had her second significant contact with Christianity there. She wrote, "Something stronger than me compelled me for the first time to go on my knees." And then she informally converted to Catholicism. She never formally got confirmed in a church, but she was driven by these mystical experiences to convert to Christianity. And there was a theme in her writings where she identifies with divine love in the midst of affliction. And she says that she identifies with Christ and his suffering. And she was later introduced to the 17th century poet George Herbert, where she claimed to feel Christ's presence while reciting Herbert's poem on love. And she had been suffering from intense headaches, but she began to realize that there was virtue in prayer. And in 1939, there was a military alliance of Germany and Italy, and she renounced her pacifism and she started to join the cause in the fighting. So in June of 1940, she left Paris with her family on the last train. They settled in Marseille, France, and at the time, it was a gathering point for people who were trying to flee from France. And she began to work with the resistance. And she was introduced to a Dominican priest named Joseph Marie Perrin, who became her close friend. And they were discussing baptism, although she never got baptized, but she began working as an agricultural laborer. And she worked at a farm in a region called Ardèche in France. And she started working in the grape harvest, and she reportedly carried Plato's Symposium, famous philosophical treatise, with her in the vineyards and tried to teach the text to her fellow laborers. And then in 1942, she agreed to leave France so her parents would be in a safe place. And she went to New York through Morocco. I believe she sailed there. And in New York, as in Marseille, she filled notebook after notebook with philosophical, theological, and mathematical considerations. And in New York, she felt sort of distanced from people in her native country suffering. So she joined something called the Free French movement in London, where she felt closer to her French people. And in 1943, she was given a small office in London. And from this room, she would write day and night for the next 4 months, sleeping only 3 hours a night. And her total output in this period totaled around 800 pages, and she resigned from the Free French movement in late July. And this is actually, sorry, this was her French combatant card when she was volunteering um, in in London. And she died in 24th of August, 1943. And this was because she actually starved herself because she was participating in a hunger strike. She was still very much involved in activism, and even though her death was ruled a suicide, I think it was more complex than that. I think she was trying to be like a martyr and suffering along with her fellow people. And she had been aware that her fellow countrymen and women in France had to live on minimal food rations. So she had participated in hunger strikes to do the same for herself, and it worsened her physical illness because she contracted tuberculosis. And on the 30th of August, she was buried at Ashford's New Cemetery uh, in some city in England, and she was her grave was originally anonymous, so they thought that it was a pauper's grave, but it was actually her grave, and then it was later identified. So she was very prolific throughout her life. She started off by writing on reflections on the war, and then her first major philosophical work was Gravity and Grace. And in this book, she has this theory where there are two opposing forces in the universe. And the first force is gravity, so it's like natural law. And then because she's religious, she believes in grace, which is another force in the universe that counteracts natural law. And if you're a Christian, you believe in sin, but God's grace is like forgiving you and bringing goodness into the world. So that's the main point of the book. And then she also wrote on a concept called rooting, or and she has other books where she talks about the importance of being rooted in a community, and then she has other works that are very theological or philosophical. She writes Waiting for God, Supernatural Knowledge, Letter to a Religious, and many other literary writings. And most of these, she had written them during her life, but then they were published after her death. So they were all published posthumously. So if we want to go over some of the themes in her writings, in her early writings, we have a Marxist analysis of oppression in the working class, and then we have Cartesian skepticism, and then a Kantian focus on the individual. These are all philosophical concepts. And then in 1935 to 1943, as she had mystical experiences and encounters with Christianity, she tried to combine spirituality with her notion of solidarity with the working class. She wrote about struggle as a condition of life, which is a theme in Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher. And she wrote about slavery in Hobbes and Hegel in 1937. And then the concept of roots, she says that it is necessary in human society because it is necessary for stability and security if growth and flourishing are to occur on the level of the individual. And in The Need for Roots, she goes into a profound examination of the human condition, where she says it's very necessary to be rooted and have a sense of belonging. And she says that establishing a genuine connection to one's environment and feeling a sense of belonging are indispensable for individuals to navigate life's complexities with deeper insight and satisfaction. And she says that being rooted in a community stabilizes individuals and allows them to engage meaningfully with the world around them. And she says that if people are not grounded or they don't have a community, then they experience existential discomfort and they have a fear of morality and detach themselves from their innate humanity. And it's a very existential exploration of what it means to belong to a community. And then when it's taken away, people feel vulnerable and then they start fearing death and they feel anxiety and detachment. And then she started synthesizing perspectives from Catholic doctrine at the fringe of the church with wisdom from various traditions such as ancient Greek philosophy and tragedies, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. So there's, I think the writings in the notebooks that she compiled at the end of her life, they're published as a book called The First and Last Notebooks, and you can find many aphorisms that are philosophical and they talk about religion in various traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism. And she believed that there was a Greek philosopher named Aeschylus, and she believed that knowledge was gained through suffering. And it it was shaped by her participation in social activism, in political activism, and religious thought, and her epistemology, which is the way that she believes we know the truth. This would change over time as she had mystical experiences. And she believes that mystery is it carries theological and supernatural implications. And she says that there's contradiction because we have affliction and suffering in the human world, but we also see goodness from God. And she says that through her religion, Christ is the solution to the contradiction between natural law or necessity and the good. And then in 1942, in some of her notebooks, as well as in the book Gravity and Grace, there's a very important concept called attention. And I believe I had an article that I had Julie distribute to you guys, but the intention includes discerning what someone is going through in his or her suffering. And for example, if there are social conditions that produce suffering, like war or famine, for example, it creates hazards and chance at any given moment, and it causes affliction. So attention is directed not by will, but a particular kind of desire without an object. So it's sort of like a free-floating attention, but we're supposed to direct our attention towards the right things. So if somebody is suffering in affliction, then we're supposed to direct our attention towards their suffering through compassion. And Weil was a Christian Platonist, influenced by philosopher Plato, but she says that desire motivating attention is oriented towards the mysterious good that draws God down. And she defines prayer as the orientation of all the attention of which the soul is capable towards good. So prayer is another way to direct attention towards suffering. And she also says, attention consists of suspending our thoughts leaving it detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. It means holding in our minds within the reach of this thought, but on the lower level and not in contact with it, the diverse knowledge we have acquired, which we are forced to make use of. Above all, our thoughts should be empty, waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object that is to enter it. So there's a religious concept called kenosis, where it's sort of like an emptying of the subject. And there's relationship between attention and kenosis in Weil. She says to empty ourselves of our false divinity, to deny ourselves, to give up being the center of the world in imagination, to discern that all points of the world are equally centers. The true center is outside the world, that is to consent to the rule of mechanical necessity in matter and of free choice at the center of each soul. Such consent is love. The face of this love, which is turned towards thinking persons, is the love of our neighbor. And she says, she also talks about friendship in her notebooks. And she says, friendship is something that is universal. So she's obviously a cosmopolitan. I mean, she was focused on activism with her native French people, but she was also a believer in extending love towards every human being. So she says we should love a human being as we should like to love each soul in particular of all those who go to make up the human race. And I know I talked about gravity and grace before, but I'll talk about it again because it's a very important work. And she talks about how death is not something to be feared, but it is to be embraced as an inherent aspect of life. And she says that this means going beyond merely acknowledging mortality. She says that death is to be viewed as an essential component of existence. And she says that accepting death is not an act of resignation, but it's rather a profound gesture of grace and wisdom. And she said that if we acknowledge that life is impermanent and it's not going to be forever, individuals are presented with an opportunity to live authentically, cherishing the fleeting beauty of each moment. And she talks about the interconnectedness between life and death in Gravity and Grace. She said that awareness of our mortality should not lead to nihilism, but rather to a heightened appreciation for the preciousness of existence. And she talks about the existential and philosophical dimensions of the human condition. And she tries to encourage enlightenment and spiritual awakening. And then she also has a book called Waiting for God, where she talks about death and the human experience once again. And she says that death can serve as broadening our philosophical perspective. And she says that it can allow individuals to live their lives with greater purpose and authenticity. And then she also wrote very extensively on some Greek literature, and she talks about the Iliad, which is Homer's epic poem, and she explores the theme of death and its relationship with human conflict. And she argues that death serves as a primal force which propels individuals towards act of brutality. And she encourages readers to contemplate the universal aspect of the human condition and the dread of mortality as a driving force behind tragic events in this poem.